Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast with your host, Buck Fantastic.
Girl Scout cookies.
When I was younger, I dreamt of growing up and leaving West Virginia for the bright lights and theatrics of New York City. The art scene is bigger and thriving there, and there's a lot more stuff to get into compared to Charleston, where you're limited to getting shit-faced drunk at a local bar, or bringing your Stevie Nicks realness to church on Sunday morning banging a tambourine, while joyfully singing to the Lord. As an adult, I can't afford to up and leave the Mountain State for the Big Apple because it's too expensive to live there, and if I ever found myself homeless, it could take years for me to wind up stably housed. On this episode of the Mothman and the Bible Belt podcast, I have homeless rights advocate, social media influencer, and New Yorker, Karim Walker. Karim is black, gay, and found himself homeless in the past. We're going to talk about housing and homelessness in New York City, race, and the exploitation of LGBT people by the business world during Pride Month. Join me, your host, Buck Fantastic, for another exciting episode of the Mothman and the Bible Belt podcast. Come be a part of it, my podcast. Karim, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. Well, hello from Brooklyn.
What's bringing you out to vote this year?
To be honest, I'm not sure if I really do have if I have any motivation to vote. Unfortunately, neither one of these political parties are addressing the people's immediate needs. Neither one of them seem to have any interest in our daily lives. They just tell us to go out and vote. I mean, you got a Republican Party that is openly fascist, that is openly willing to violate people's voting rights. But at the same time, you have a Democratic Party that is at best ineffectual and at worst a co-conspirator. This is a party. I mean, we know that the Republican Party has no interest in improving people's daily lives. I mean, the Democrats, they talk, but at the end of the day, it's just talk.
They talk the talk, they don't want to walk it.
No, and you want people to come out and vote for you. You got to give them a reason to do so.
Is there a lot of third-party candidates running where you're at?
To my knowledge, there is a young man who is running for a seat in the New York State Legislature. His name is Kieran Alain. He's out here in the East New York section of Brooklyn, and is actually and some have seen him as a younger and a slightly more progressive version of Charles Barron, who is the longtime New York City council member out of this district, as well as the state, and had just finished 2 terms in the state legislature, I believe. I believe it was 2. It might actually have been 3.
Is he an independent, a Green Party, or Worker World?
I think he's actually tied to I think he has affiliations with the local DSA, with our local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America chapter here in Brooklyn. But I don't want us to be. I've gotten some mailings from his candidates from his campaign in the past, but I haven't seen any kind of political affiliation. If he's an independent, if he's a Democrat, or what have you, or Green.
I only came out to vote for one candidate in the primary. I voted for several, but only one candidate brought me out. This guy, Martise Washington, he was primarying.
Yes.
Mayor Amy Goodwin, who's a Democrat. And while I'm not a fan of Democrats, he's talking about solutions to homelessness, drug addiction, poverty, and she wants to just police the city of Charleston out of these problems.
Yeah, and as we've seen in various parts of the country, and I'm talking about my own experience as a formerly homeless person, as well as someone who is working with homeless people right now, that you cannot police your way out of homelessness. We're seeing this right now with Mayor Adams here in New York City, basically sending the police force out in full effect to target homeless people. And now he's starting to deal with the backlash and the blowback from that.
Is there a lot of sweeps where you're at of
There,
homeless encampments?
there are sweeps going on, and they tend to happen with a fairly regular intensity. We've had, and in some cases, the same location will get swept up two, sometimes even three times in the span of a week. Yeah, they will normally put the notices up a day or two in advance, telling you that this is where we are going to be. They don't give you a time, but they do give you a date, and it will be who's coming out. They'll be so usually they'll say there's it's usually sanitation, social services, as well as the police. So it's and this is something that is not novel to the city, to Adams's administration. His predecessor, Bill de Blasio, had done the same thing. In his 8 years as mayor of New York City, de Blasio administration had conducted approximately 9,000 sweeps. Two-thirds of those. Now, here's the thing that really will blow you out of the water. Approximately two-thirds of those sweeps happened within the last year of his term in office.
Do y'all have enough homeless shelters to house everyone that's actually staying on the streets in New York?
I could do you one better than that. We have enough. We have approximately between the shelters and people on the streets and subways. We have approximately 100,000 homeless New Yorkers. We have double the number of vacant apartments. So let me, for your listeners, let me just spell it out for them. We can house every homeless person in New York, in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and still have vacant apartments.
Are those apartments outrageously priced?
Unfortunately, they are. We do have housing vouchers that do allow people to move out of the shelter. Here's the problem, though. The onus is on the recipients of those vouchers to find landlords who are willing to take them. New York City does have what is called a source of income discrimination law, meaning that landlords and brokers cannot, under certain circumstances, cannot deny you an apartment or to show you an apartment depending on how you're paying your rent. Obviously, landlords, and the reason why a lot of landlords have been doing this sort of thing was because back in 2011, that monstrosity, Bloomberg, had actually ended a very successful, if somewhat flawed, program that was housing New York City people, residents, and a lot of landlords got burnt in the process. Not to mention the tenants themselves. Some neighborhoods you can find apartments in Park Slope, Brooklyn, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, or Lower Manhattan, really are going to be north, like $1 million condos. And you can also find places like here in East New York, even in places like New York City, in the East New York section of Brooklyn, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn, rent is still obscenely high. I would say it's probably like for a 2-bedroom apartment, you could probably be paying about $2,000 to $2,000 to $3,000 a month for fair market.
Wow. Is that with washer and dryer hookups?
Well, many of the older buildings don't have those washer dryer hookups because they might not be allowed to have them for a variety of reasons. That's why laundromats tend to be very prevalent in our area. My building actually does have one, but that's because I'm in a recently built building. So some of the newer buildings may have them.
It's $800 some for a fair market 2-bedroom unit in Charleston.
Wow.
Affordable housing, quality of housing, it's not a huge priority for any of our policymakers, either on the city level, the county level, and the state level.
Certainly not the state level. And for your listeners, I should also hasten to add that now, for those who don't know New York City or New York State, real estate in New York State is a pretty dirty business. And I'm quoting one of my former roommates in that regard. The real estate lobby is a very powerful lobby in New York State. Our incumbent governor Kathy Hochul. She has ties to that lobby. Richie Torres, who is now a member of Congress out of the Bronx, he's actually taken money from the real estate lobby, even though he himself had grown up in NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority public housing units, and was endorsed by the Justice Democrats in 2020. It is very, very, but to have that kind of weight in your corner it speaks volumes about what kind of a person you are and what kind of a politician you are as well.
How much is an affordable house where you live?
Let's define affordable first.
Well,
I
in
think
West
that's
Virginia, it is possible to find something remotely nice around the 60, 80 mark. We have a lot of some dilapidated buildings and some that can be fixed up
okay.
that are dirt cheap, about $15,000, where I used to live in the Kanawha City section of Charleston.
Okay.
But they're fixer uppers. You probably have to spend 30 grand, but still that'd be cheap. For West Virginia, that would be cheap. Spending about 60, 80 grand on a house, that would be cheap. Where you're at, I know everything is exponentially far more expensive.
Yeah, I've seen houses, even at the low end. I would be hard pressed to find anything less than $500,000 in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Do y'all have any community land trusts?
We have a few. We have again. We don't have it's not a citywide one. It's neighborhood. It's based on. They're neighborhood based. But I believe we do have one here in East New York. Yes. There are a few also out in Manhattan as well. I believe East Harlem has one, as well as and I believe, I could be wrong. There are a few out in Queens as well.
Are they beneficial at keeping housing below market?
They do a good enough job, but the problem is that there's such a dearth of the land trusts, and B, the unused land as well. So it's not always easy to make sure that we can get the housing that we need for the people that need it the most. Even though, like I said, we have enough vacant apartments to house enough homeless people in the city.
How did you wind up homeless? Prior.
This is a very ugly story. It was actually a process. It was like a decade-long process. I would find a place, I would lose it, I would find it. My most recent bout of homelessness was back in 2019, the result of a landlord. I had found out that the building that I was living in did not have the right paperwork while I was trying to get repairs done in a place I had been living for approximately 18 months. I took my landlords to court to get them to make the necessary repairs, and the courts ruled in my favor in the repairs. And about 6 weeks later, I got a letter from my landlord's attorney saying that they were starting eviction proceedings against me. I should also let me make this clear. In New York City, if a landlord cannot start eviction proceedings for you until 6 months after you have filed a housing, what we call in the city, a housing part, which is a petition for the courts to look through to make sure that to get repairs done in your building if you need it. Whatever my building had a serious rodent infestation problem. We also had a ceiling in the hallway outside our building, outside our unit, that let in water if it rained hard enough, or in some cases even snowed hard enough. We had peeling paint. We had just there were no. The common areas were not safe. They were not clean, and the landlords just would not. Now they were an elderly couple, and which I probably would have given them the benefit of the doubt. Like I said, they're an elderly couple, probably can't keep up with but it got to the point that they refused. It's like they absolutely refused to do anything. I withheld rent, which was my right, and then decided, all right, if they're not going to, if they refuse to do anything, maybe the courts can do something, and the courts did.
And they retaliated.
A retaliatory eviction.
Is that common where you're at in Brooklyn?
To be honest, if it is, it would not surprise me in the slightest because landlords have each other's back, so they know who not to rent to, who they should, who they could rent to, who they should not rent to, who are the troublemakers, and what have you. And of course, New York City has what's informally called the tenant blacklist. It's a list that the city keeps that landlords can pay for to see which potential tenants have been through housing court in the past for non-payment of rent or for other violations of the lease or what have you. And if your name comes up on it, it becomes considerably more difficult to rent down the road in New York City. Now, mind you, the city has a tenant blacklist. They don't have a landlord blacklist either, even though they do have a list of but they do have something similar. A list of the 100 worst landlords in the city.
So they have a slumlord list.
They do have something like it's. You could call it a slumlord list, yeah. And there are names on that list that do. If you are in the city long enough, you'll be like, how in the hell are these guys allowed to be landlords in the first place?
When you were homeless, as a result of the eviction, how long did it take you to find remotely affordable housing?
Believe it or not, about a year and a half. I'll explain why. While I was living in that unit, I kept applying for affordable housing lotteries. The building I'm in right now, I had applied for it back in 2018. It is a process. It's a long process to apply.
In Charleston, if you wind up homeless and you're actually from West Virginia, we got a lot of people coming from out of state to get on Section 8 vouchers because I know in some places you can be on a waiting list for up to 8 years or more.
Yep.
But in Charleston, it's 3 to 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
that's pretty efficient. I mean,
it is, but it's sad that others have to wait, you know? And that
indeed.
others find it necessary to migrate here just to get them, and they have to wait a little bit more longer when they do come here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I understand. I really do. A lot of people get a little pissy with the out-of-staters, but they have a right to housing too.
Yeah, housing is a human right. Absolutely. People would not have to feel the need to come from out of state to West Virginia if if their home states actually had either a faster process for Section 8 or even had open lists for Section 8 as well. Because I know in New York City, we have been open. I don't believe the city's opened up her Section 8 list in at least a decade.
Shit.
Yeah.
That's inhumane.
Yeah, that's like, it's not just inhumane, it's downright criminal. You've got people living on the streets, but you won't open up your Section 8 list.
That's why I don't want to leave West Virginia. I mean, we may be all kinds of horrible things in a lot of people's eyes, but we do have a lot of social service programs that can help people in need, and we do have an easy, because our population's a lot less than Brooklyn and New York cities. It's a lot easier to get a Section 8 voucher if you fall flat on your ass. If I were to go to New York, I would go to Los Angeles, I would go to Oregon, I would be majorly fucked.
Oh, yeah.
And I would probably be homeless for a very long time, lose my goddamn mind, and wind up in the loony bin.
Yeah. Homelessness is not just a social problem, it's a national disgrace. What I said earlier about the city having more vacant apartments than having homeless people is it's not just New York City. This is a nationwide thing. We have approximately a little over 500,000 people living on the streets, experiencing homelessness right now, homeless people in the country right now. We have approximately 17 million apartments and residences that are sitting vacant right now. And this is a system that's going to go. This is a problem that's not going to get any better. If anything, it's about to get a whole lot worse. New York State just ended her eviction moratorium earlier this year. We are going to see a lot of landlords filing eviction proceedings right now at an obscenely exponential rate, where we're going to see a lot more people become homeless.
You hear a lot about inflation this and inflation that when it comes to gas and food prices skyrocketing.
Mhm.
Do you think it's price gouging or the Ukraine hysteria
I think
leading
it's
up to
more.
this?
I think it's more price gouging because we were already seeing prices going up prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Um, and a lot of people are on social media talking about how, or who are trying to defend Biden by saying he can't do anything about that, about price gouging. He can't do anything about inflation.
That's bullshit.
That is so, nothing could be further from the truth because Richard Nixon issued Executive Order 11615, I believe it was in 1973 or 1972, where he basically froze food and gas prices in the wake of crippling stagflation. It's not that would come to dominate the 1970s. So a president does have that power if he wishes to use it.
He ain't using his executive orders like he could.
No,
He
he's
could be
not.
helping a lot. He could be helping a lot of people who can't afford homes simply because of their student loan debt. So, Karim, you're openly gay and black.
Mhm.
Is that still looked upon as a liability in the black community?
It is, but I think it's starting to people are learning to tone it down a little bit, to tone down the homophobia a little bit because now you're seeing shows such as RuPaul's Drag Race, where you're consistently seeing black contestants coming out and showing black people what they're capable of. You have a show on Broadway right now called A Strange Loop, which is the most queer friendly show since Rent. But there's a lot that needs to be done because we've seen a lot of my trans siblings, especially my trans sisters, being meaning brutal, tragic ends. And it's not just here in Brooklyn; it's also in various parts of the country as well. I believe there was a recent murder in about a year or so ago in Kansas City that I believe has been unsolved. I think there have been a few cases of trans women being murdered in Texas as well. So it is a national phenomenon that trans women are being murdered, especially trans women of color are being targeted.
My neighbor, she lived a few houses up from me. She was a black trans woman and also a prostitute. But that's a reality for a lot of trans people, regardless of who they are.
Yeah.
She met her fate in the early 2000s. Some military guy got it in his head he was going to fuck with her and took hold of her purse. She was held onto it, drug her down McCorkle Avenue in the Canal City section of Charleston. She had a broken hip. 2 weeks later, she died from complications of that. And the guy who did it appeared in court in military uniform. And like that's something to be proud of. And he was supposed to get nearly 20 years. I looked a few months ago. He got out a few years back. So it was like a slap. It was a slap on the wrist. And that's how poorly people view the LGBT community in this, especially trans people. It's horrible what people have to endure who are trans just to survive. And again, lots of trans people have to turn to, they don't have to, but they do turn
To
to
sex work
sex work.
to survive and to make the transition that they need to live the lives that they need.
It shouldn't be that way in this day and age.
No, no.
What's your thoughts about Jill Biden?
Jill,
Yeah,
First Lady. Oh, dear.
unveiling that Nancy Reagan stamp
At,
during Pride Month.
at best, it was tone deaf. At worst, it was very hypocritical. It was at best poor taste and tone deaf because we all know anyone who's even had a working knowledge. Those who are too young to remember the early days of the AIDS crisis, you had people like Nancy Reagan laughing in secret, in private, about gay men dying of HIV, of this disease that was just ravaging gay America, LGBT gay men in the United States, and would later destroy, kill over a million, I believe over 1.5 million Americans.
And a great deal of them were black.
Yeah, and most of them were. And the sad thing is that, like you said, the majority of them were black men as well as black women were coming down with this disease. Um, and this and the Reagan administration was a was obscenely callous in its response to this. Remember, and it didn't. Ronald Reagan did not publicly mention the word AIDS until 1987.
And we still don't have a cure.
And yeah, we're talking about. And I turned 41.
A commercial cure. A commercial cure. I mean, there have been those bone marrow stem cell transplants,
Yes.
but those damn things can kill you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no commercial. I mean,
Exactly.
I figured by now we would have, now all we have is PrEP.
Yeah, all we have is Truvada, all we have is Descovy. And it's important and it's imperative that we know that those are designed for those who are designed male at birth, not female. So so
it's not effective in.
We don't know. I'm not a physician, and I have not taken part of any studies about its efficacy in women. But those were drugs that were designed and geared towards men. What are the HIV rates, infection rates in West Virginia these days? If you don't mind me asking.
They're up among IV users for the most part in Kanawha County and in Cabell County. These are heterosexual people.
Okay.
So I mean, we're seeing an insurgence in my county, Kanawha County. 3 years ago, they got rid of our harm reduction clinic at the health department. And last year, the city of Charleston added a penalty for operating an unauthorized harm reduction program because we had people here who were doing it rogue. They were handing out clean needles to people who were users because they were seeing the numbers of HIV go up. And it was crazy. And that mayor, Amy Goodwin, I was talking about earlier, when she was running, she was all, I support harm reduction. And then she goes and does that shit. And the people in Charleston who helped her, they didn't do anything for her primary opponent. That's what's really fucked up. They were trashing her over that and trashing her over her response to homelessness, but they wouldn't step up to the plate and help someone who was with their platform to try to unseat the woman. And that was really disappointing. It's why I'm not involved in West Virginia politics. I mean, I think people remember what happened to Paula Swearigan in 2018.
Yes. And and the Democratic Party basically backed Joe Manchin.
They wouldn't even let Paula Swearigan, the state party, wouldn't even let her speak at their 2018 Democratic Party fundraiser. Wow. They wouldn't let her speak. That was real. That's real. That's how it just shows how corrupt this party is. But again, we saw what happened with Paula in 2018, and it happened again with 2022 with Martise Washington.
Yes.
And the very people who were supposedly pro Paula, who did nothing for her, did nothing for Martise. As of this moment, I haven't seen any third-party candidates enter the race. Hopefully one will, but we're going to have a lot more problems because hepatitis C is off the chain here.
That kind of makes sense. And I'm assuming the biggest victims right now, the biggest number is coming from IV drug users as well.
Yeah, that's the biggies because drugs are so bad here and so prevalent. I've only seen like 1 or 2 needles within the past 5 years. You have some people who are grossly overstating the needle litter that they see, and it's causing policymakers to have this horrible knee-jerk reaction that is vehemently We do have a harm reduction program West Virginia Health Right operates,
Yes.
but it's a one for one. It's not needs based.
Yeah, we have something like that. Similar. We have a similar issue here in New York City. Mayor Adams, a few weeks ago, I don't think it was a few months ago, but rather a few weeks ago, had held at one of his press conferences following a raid on a homeless encampment. Showed to a bunch of news media figures a picture taken of a boat of like bunch of needles, and asked, "Is this dignity?" And but but I can tell you right now, homelessness alongside with homeless drug use is not all homeless people are drug users. When I was on the streets, I wasn't a drug user, and it's still not. Um, but there are, and we do have we just opened our first shooting gallery a few weeks ago, um, and I think there is medical staff on site to help in case of any kind of overdoses, which is and in my outreach, I sometimes come across folks who from local clinics who've actually given me Narcan that I keep on me every now and then in case I encounter an overdose. God forbid, thank goodness I haven't encountered one yet, but it's good to have just in case. Is West Virginia looking at the prospect of having people get Narcan kits in their home?
We have the county passing out the Narcan, and doing trainings. That's a positive.
Yeah,
But a lot of people who are doing drugs because of their economic situation. And
exactly.
that needs to be tackled first and foremost. A lot of the jobs around here pay just a little bit above minimum wage. You can be lucky and get some that pay $11, $12, but that's not enough to dig you out of the poorhouse
So,
and allow you to be self sufficient.
and the union, and I'm assuming the coal mining, because I believe coal mining is one of the biggest industries in the state. The
Was.
energy was one of the so the coal miners unions are probably they have seen their numbers shrink considerably over the past few years, have they not?
Yeah, because of environmental regulations and the fact that coal's expensive. Coal's expensive, coal's dirty. Realistically, as new emerging technologies regarding energy generation get developed, it's
Yeah,
going to happen.
yeah,
The
that makes sense.
UMWA only here recently have come out in support of economic diversification. They should have done this decades ago.
Wow. I wonder what the reason. I wonder why they came to the party. Why
They're,
they finally decided to come to the party.
they were attached to the hip of the industry. It got corrupt. I mean, I remember reading a few years ago in the Charleston Gazette Mail, Cecil Roberts, the UMWA president,
Yeah,
addressed the industry regarding climate change about a decade ago. He
yeah,
should have been addressing the fucking miners and giving them the 411 about coal's reality in this state instead of lying
exactly.
to them and playing to the war on coal bullshit, which is everywhere in West Virginia.
Yeah,
That's it's contributing to a lot of poverty. If you live in West Virginia, you're a miner. The likelihood of you getting injured on the job
yeah.
because of regulations, and that's fueled a lot of the opioid problems in this state. So, I mean, it's great that they're finally coming around, but it should have happened decades ago. I'm
Indeed.
not I'm not hating on coal miners. Everyone has the right to a job, whether you agree with that job or not. But
Exactly.
everyone most definitely deserves the right to a safe workplace. And the Coal Association in West Virginia have been going after workplace safety, environmental regulations meant to protect your air and water. So
Wow.
that's while pretending to be friends of coal miners, which is the biggest insult.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I care about my coal miners. I come from a coal family on my mom's side. I
Yeah.
respect them. I love them. I'm not going to degrade them like Hillary. But, reality is reality. Coal is, we're not going to
Coal
be
is a
using
dirty
it.
business, literally.
Literally a dirty business. And realistically, we'll be lucky to be using it for two or three more decades on a global level. Do you think our country is doing enough in regards to race relations currently?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The way we do race relations in this country, how we address race relations in this country, it's those are the solutions are cosmetic in nature. People thinking that once we had the first black president in Barack Obama, race was going to be. We had someone like Dinesh D'Souza saying that we now live in a post-racial society and that race is not an issue anymore. And we got kind of lackadaisical in our approach to race relations. The deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and later George Floyd, among others, Philando Castile, among others, disabused us of that notion. And of course, Trayvon Martin as well.
And
Uh,
Breonna Taylor.
and Breonna Taylor, definitely Breonna Taylor. And of course, like I said, um, because for a variety of reasons, I'll give you an example. Blacks make up approximately 1 in 8 of the U.S. population, but we are roughly one, I believe, 2/3 of the U.S. prison population. We have lower life expectancies. We have, of course, lower educational attainment. We have lower. We are more likely to have not to go without health care, hence lower life expectancy. We have lower income. Uh, we have lower incomes, less wealth, lower income levels. Let's say lower income. And we feel, yet at the same time, we feel like this government could be doing more, should be doing more, and has failed to do more to do right by her black citizens. A lot of us are in heavily segregated areas of the country, or even within the city. Case in point, I can tell you right now, here in the East New York, I'll give you an example. East New York is predominantly black, even though you're starting to see a few more whites living in this part of Brooklyn. We are more likely to live in places that are going to be gentrified, and which will lead to further displacement of black residents.
Are you surprised the White House isn't moving quickly on sensible gun control reforms to ban automatic high magazine rifles after the Uvalde Elementary School shooting that left 19 children and 2 teachers dead?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We are talking about Uvalde, I believe, is in the Texas 28th congressional district. That is represented by Henry Cuellar. For those who are, that's a name that is, if you are into politics, if you study politics, that's the name that should be familiar to you. Cuellar is the last anti-abortion Democrat in the House. He has been campaign. He's had people such as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, and Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic Caucus Chair, who is actually my congressman in the House, come out and campaign for him against the sensible immigrant lawyer Jessica Cisneros. We are talking about the Biden administration, a man who at one time was a fan, if not a fan, at least an ally of the National Rifle Association. It's not a surprise at all that the White House is dragging its feet on any kind of sensible gun control, because we know that gun control can and does save lives. No, we're not talking about seizing up every gun in the country, though other countries have done that, such as Australia following the 1996 massacre. But we are talking about background checks, limits to how many guns you can purchase, licensing of guns and gun owners, among other things. Those are very sensible and those are very easy to do if we have the political willpower to do so.
Last year, the West Virginia legislature passed a bill that forbid law enforcement from enforcing new federal gun control legislation unless it exists in state code. The vast majority of both Democrats and Republicans supported that bill. What's your thoughts on that?
I, I'm trying to. I think you can see my jaw just descending to the point that I was almost on the floor. I want to make sure I heard this correctly. The state government of West Virginia passed a law that banned the enforcement of federal law, federal gun control legislation.
unless it exists in state code already. The police cannot enforce any new laws unless it exists in state code. And this was during the 2021 legislative session.
This is so over the. I mean, we talk about.
It's beyond fucked up.
I mean, I can't. I can't. There are no words for what I'm about to. Because if I, what I want to say will probably get me kicked off of Twitter and will get me kicked off this podcast right now. That is so over the top, wrong, and horrible. I don't even know how you can. First of all, how can you even enforce such a law? This is at best government overreach, the same government overreach that so-called libertarians bemoan all the time. And at the same time, and at the same time, you have just basically hamstrung the police. Now, mind you, the police are not. The Supreme Court has already ruled that the police are not obligated to ensure your safety. But this is still just so many levels of just fucked up beyond all recognition that I don't even know how to make heads or tails out of it.
Obama started caging immigrant children. Trump continued it, and the Biden administration is currently whitewashing the situation, which to my understanding is still ongoing. Do you think caging immigrants, albeit children or adults, makes this country look godly or moralistic?
It's quite moralistic. It's also unsurprising as well. If you look at the history of this country and how it's treated immigrant children, you've had kids who lived in the Lower East Side, whose kids who were living in the Lower East Side in the 1880s, 1890s, snatched up and sent 1,000 miles away to Kansas and Nebraska on these orphan trains, and then you also had children who are from the First Nations, this country's First Nations, being ripped from their families and sent to schools like the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. So keeping kids in cages, as disgusting and as heartbreaking and as outrageous, as morally repugnant as that is, it's not the exception to this. If anything, it's the norm. These places are now de facto petri dishes at a macro level.
What should immigration reform look like, in your opinion?
Immigration reform in this country would start with asylum reform. Anyone who needs asylum in this country should be allowed to get it. It should be a much quicker process. It should be a much more streamlined process. Also, we should start looking at pulling back the roadblocks to naturalized citizenship in this country as well, because 9/11 did make attaining citizenship a little more difficult than it had been in years past. We need to start pulling those back as well.
I think one thing that should be discussed, which people really aren't having that much of a discussion about in this country, is getting the CIA to stop meddling in South and Central American government affairs.
Indeed.
Because it's a huge contributing factor to the destabilization going on in those countries, which are leading those immigrants to leave for the U.S.
Exactly. The United States, the CIA has really been a major player in some of the worst crimes and some of the biggest tragedies over the past 60 years. I think the best example is what happened in Chile in 1973, with where a Bank of America financed CIA-backed coup led to the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende being overthrown, and in its place you have Augusto Pinochet, which
He was a
will,
monster.
to put it nicely, I think you're being very diplomatic in that regard. Um, for 17 years, Pinochet ruled Chile with an iron fist, made allies with some of the worst reactionaries in the Western Hemisphere. I think he had ties with the South African government and the apartheid South African government in South Africa. The CIA has done some very terrible. Has been has been an agent for overthrowing some democratically elected governments throughout the Western Hemisphere. I think it also played a role in the the 1964 coup in Brazil as well, which led to the military dictatorship that will last for 2 decades.
A friend of mine told me that they had a hand in Iran when they got rid of the Shah. I'm
They
not
did.
sure. I'm not
I
sure
believe
to what extent. She was living in Iran at the time, so
sure, your friend was right. For those who don't, for a little background for your listeners, in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, was overthrown, and in his place, the Shah was put back into power, um, and became a very close ally to the United States government for the next. The Shahs of Iran became very close to the to the U.S. government over the next 2 decades. In fact, the Shah it was in the United States in 1979 when he was having surgery, right around the same time that the students took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital, and held it for 444 days. Yeah.
a year ago, I read an article coming from the perspective of a gay black man about white people fetishizing black men for packing heat. Do you find this to be true of white men that
More
they
than I
fetishize?
more than I realized. I mean, I've hooked up with quite a few white men in my day, and almost all of them are like the first question is, how hung are you? Forgive me for being crass. And it's like, okay,
So they're looking for a BBC.
yes, they are. That too. That too.
Porn star Sean Zavron was the person that was talking about that. Do you perceive that as being racist or as an unfair stereotype? Because not all black men
I
are
would
hung
not
like a
call it.
horse.
I wouldn't call it racist, but I would call it a stereotype because, of course, we all know the stereotype of black men being well endowed, and that was the reason why a lot of them got, especially in the 1800s in the antebellum South, and even there in the decades in the era of Jim Crow, a lot of them were lynched. The reasons for those lynchings were sexual in nature more often than not. It's a stereotype that has carried on even after the worst years of Jim Crow lynchings had passed. Seems at this point to have remained seared in the collective American psyche that black men, straight as well as gay, are to be used as
Objects.
sexual objects. Yeah, I think to be objectified and fetishized for their sexual prowess, not just for their sexual for their anatomy, but for their sexual prowesses as well.
When it comes to the LGBT community, do you think that black, gay, bisexual, and transgender people have a large enough voice in the community?
That's something we're working on. That's something that needs to be worked on because for decades we had to work on visibility. Just being seen was an accomplishment, even though to be black and LGBTQ was not unheard of. The visibility was still an issue, especially since the contributions from black LGBTQ voices has been there almost since the founding of this country. I mean, the first drag queen, the first modern drag queen, was not only gay, was of course not only the first modern drag queen was not only black, but may have actually been a former slave if the records are actually true. We've had black artists, black musicians, black writers who were LGBTQ, like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. You had, of course, Alvin Ailey, who was probably the greatest American choreographer of the 20th century. And then even to this day, and up to actors such as Billy Porter and athletes such as Jason Collins are finally being seen after all this time. Now we have to work on the voices being heard.
You don't see a lot of black LGBT voices heading up these organizations or
No,
serving on the boards. You may see one black person or two black people serving on the board, but you don't see a whole lot in leadership.
and that is tokenism at its worst. That should not surprise anybody at this point, because you'll put a black person on in a boardroom, and then go out at a Fortune 500 company. And this is something that's very prevalent, and not just limited to nonprofit organizations. This is corporate America as well, America writ large as well. You see it in government, you see it in American business and industry, you see it in American academia as well. And even in, you'll have folks looking in, thinking, "Oh, we got a black person on on the board of a Fortune 500 company," but how hard did it get for him to be on that board? How much of a fight was? We didn't see the fight there was for him to be on that board, and we don't even know how much of a say that person has in board related matters. There's a very fine line in this country between diversity / inclusion and naked sheer tokenism.
Will you explain tokenism for my listeners? Because a lot of people aren't completely familiar with it. I just learned what it was a few years ago. We had people of color who were working at a reproductive rights organization that accused that organization of tokenism, transphobia, a toxic workplace,
Okay.
and they got cease and desist letters because they went batshit crazy, as they should have, on social media. So the board sent them cease and desist letters,
Wow.
and yeah, it was really insulting, and the press wouldn't even cover it. At the same time, the owner of the Charleston Gazette Mail happens to be Delegate Doug Scaff.
Wow. All
And
right. Well,
he is in bed with that organization. He gives to that reproductive rights organization, and they make him out to be hot shit.
tokenism is just a practice where a predominantly white body of individuals will have some white, and I should say white, male, and probably cisgender and heterosexual, will have someone who does not fit one of those boxes on the board in the name of diversity. So they might have, it might be like 20, there might be 20 white men, all straight, all male, all straight and all white and all male. And then they might have a woman on the board, or they might have a black male on the board, or they might have, and in some cases, it doesn't. That tokenism can be extended to someone who is disabled, with someone with a disability, with a physical or mental disability as well. And they'll just say that they'll have that person on that body, on that governing body, as the diversity hire. In the name, they'll put that person out in the front to show that they are committed, that the company or the organization is somehow committed to effective change, social justice, diversity, inclusion, equity, equality.
A lot of businesses are using Pride Month to market themselves, to pretend to be more inclusive of LGBT people.
I am so glad you asked this question.
Yet
I am so glad.
many are paying their employees, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, so poorly. Many of those workers have to work 2 or 3 jobs to get by. And yet you don't see people in the hierarchy of the LGBT community condemning these businesses. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, pride is always, it should be first and foremost about the people. I think we all know that. It should not be about the corporations. The corporations, especially considering the fact that a lot of these corporations are the same ones that turn around and donate to Greg Abbott and Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, to these rabidly anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ politicians. Case in point is AT&T, that at one point I donated close to $500,000 to Governor Abbott of Texas. Pride should under no circumstances be used as a marketing tool. Just like Black Lives Matter should not be used as a marketing tool. Um, Pride, like I said, is about the people, and, about our pain, about our struggles, about our victories, and what we want for the next generation of queer kids and our queer grandkids. The companies that are using Pride to market themselves and then turning around, but not paying their employees better, it's just as disheartening as it is. It's not surprising at all either. Especially when we know that LGBTQ work employees tend to get paid less than their straight and cisgender counterparts anyway. That's why it's up to organizations that are supposed to speak on behalf of LGBTQ Americans, places such as the Human Rights Coalition and others, and GLAAD, should really step up, put the feet of corporations to the fire, and demand that they do better by by queer employees. I also say that this is something that labor unions should do as well,
Mm-hmm.
because there have been times when organized labor has not always been in our corner for whatever reasons. Maybe it's the leadership, maybe it's just. But the fact of the matter is, there must be queer rights, queer working and workers' rights go hand in hand with each other. There should be solidarity between the two. And there have been times when labor unions have done a great job being allies for LGBTQ America, but I feel like they can still be better allies.
There's a business on the west side of Charleston called Bugs and Brews.
Yeah.
They have this big pride display in their storefront. Love is love, the rainbow, all that shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they were one of several businesses on the west side that came out and spoke against the Religious Coalition for Community Renewal's proposed ARPA-funded day shelter.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, they show love for the LGBT community.
Except when it really matters.
Yeah. But you got a lot of LGBT people who are homeless,
Exactly.
especially teens.
40%, I believe 40% of homeless teens identify as LGBTQ. That's a huge.
That's
huge
what's so
number.
fucked up about that.
That's
and
a
yet a
huge
lot of people
number.
don't see the correlation.
Exactly.
I mean, don't use us. Don't use us to market yourself and to feel like you're doing something that's game changing, earth shattering. It's not. It really
It's
isn't.
not.
You're using a marginalized community that has been exploited, especially in the past 2 decades,
Yes.
by corporate America, who still, again, are working against the collective interests of not just LGBT people, but all people who are poor and struggling and who are living paycheck to paycheck and are themselves
Amen.
one step away from homelessness.
Amen. We say on social media that the first Pride was a riot, and it was. There were two of all of our enemies, political / social, whatever. There were two in particular that really stuck out. One was law enforcement. The other were the corporations. A lot of people don't remember that the cop, up until, like you said, up until about 20 years ago, we didn't exactly have allies in corporate America, and we really don't still. We really don't still. Like I said, because a lot of these corporations are donating to anti-gay politicians, anti-LGBTQ politicians, and nobody's going to be ever the wiser about that.
And you have the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, still rooting on outsourcing jobs to China, and he's openly gay.
Yes, and even within Fortune 500 companies where there is an LGBTQ presence, it's not like they're doing much to advance our causes. You've got, like you said, you mentioned Tim Cook. I believe you've also had someone like an Anderson Cooper, who, when was the last time he actually interviewed LGBTQ union uh, uh, employees about working conditions in some of the companies? When has he interviewed someone from Starbucks, for a Starbucks employee from a unionized workplace?
I
Or
wouldn't call
not even,
him a hard-hitting journalist at all. I mean, he and the rest of, whether they're straight or gay, whether it's Don Lemon, they throw softball questions. They're not asking anything hard of anyone in corporate America, especially
no,
when
they're
it
not.
comes to them helping to contribute to this country's poverty problems.
Exactly. That's pretty damn sad, actually.
This is my third podcast episode dealing with unaffordable housing. Unaffordable housing is a reality for many in our country. We cannot and should not expect people to work 2 or 3 jobs to afford the luxury of basic survival. Our policymakers need to do more to make housing more affordable and attainable for people of all walks of life. Housing should be a basic human right. If we keep the unaffordable housing issue in our policymakers' faces, sooner or later they'll have no choice but to act on it. I want to thank my special guest, Karim Walker. His story is one experienced by many Americans. Comparing and contrasting housing and homelessness in Charleston and New York City isn't completely apples and oranges. While our populations are extremely different in terms of size, racial demographics, and incomes, what we have in common is that both cities' policymakers are dragging their feet on long-term sustainable solutions to homelessness, drug addiction, poverty, and affordable housing. You can find Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast outlet updates, guest bios, and links to social media on mothmaninthebiblebelt.com. Thanks for listening!